Welcome to the Mets Pod. On today's show, it's our trade deadline preview, and we'll be joined by SNY's MLB insider Andy Martino. Then Joe and I will recap the Mets' first move acquiring Daniel Vogelbach, sending Collin Holderman to the Pittsburgh Pirates. We'll talk about the lineup, and as always, we will answer your mailbag questions. So reminder, subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Mets Pod. The trade deadline is right around the corner. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo, and we are very excited to be joined by SNY's MLB insider, Andy Martino. Andy, it is a absolute crazy time of year, as always, around the trade deadline. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm fine, thank you. It's not my first rodeo, Connor. It's what it is. It's fun it's fun this time of year because although I think we all fell in love with the sport because we like baseball games, this stuff is fun in moderation too. The speculation and the reporting and what's going to happen with teams that are in it, and that's definitely fun too. So I enjoy it.
And it probably helps that you cover two teams in the Mets and the Yankees that should be quite active around this trade deadline. So I'll start right there and just ask the simple question. Do you think Billy Eppler is feeling any pressure from ownership, or it could even be the fan base or whatever it may be, to make a splash move? Or do you think this is a franchise, while Eppler wasn't in that chair last year, that might have learned a lesson in acquiring Javi Baez as a rental, but paying a hard price, sending Pete Crow Armstrong?
Yeah, the latter. I think a lesson might be a little strong, although maybe that's fair. I think I like the Baez trade from last year because of where the Mets were at that time. And I disagree that it didn't work out, if anyone would say that, because look, did they end up where they wanted to be? No, but you don't know that on July 31st, and Mets fans would have rioted if they hadn't made a splash last year, given where they were at. But yes, Pete Crow Armstrong's been good this year in the Cubs system. I think that's definitely given the Mets some pause this year. And I don't think that Eppler is feeling much pressure from above him for that reason, because Steve Cohen has developed this caricature persona among some in the public, like, oh, he's impulsive, he's rash, he'll do anything. But that's actually not the Steve Cohen who deals with his baseball people. They know him as somebody who is driven to win, but sees that as a byproduct of having a strong organization. And I think Cohen seems to have pretty good baseball instincts, where he knows that you can't do this every single year, go all in, trade all your prospects. For that reason, I don't think they do trade a Francisco Alvarez or a Brett Baty in order to win a World Series, unless it's Juan Soto, who I don't think they're in on. So that's another topic. But, for realistic trades, I do think they're taking a small step back from the aggressive posture they were in last year. They're looking for upgrades. Obviously, they've already made one in Vogelbach, or they hope that's an upgrade. But no, I agree with your premise, Connor, that they are not looking to trade a player of the caliber of Crow Armstrong this year.
What's the interest level in Dom Smith and or J.D. Davis in this market? Do you think teams are looking at those guys as change of scenery candidates, or are they more just sort of throw-ins in a package?
Somewhere in between that, Joe, probably. Their value obviously isn't. They haven't done anything to help Billy Eppler in terms of their performance to create that trade value. I think other teams probably sense that if the Mets don't move a Dom Smith, he's a potential DFA in August. So the Mets don't necessarily have a lot of leverage there. I mean, depending, he's on the injured list now. You can play that out for a while too. But the Vogelbach trade pretty much means that the bats for Smith have dried up with the Mets. So could they get anything? I don't know. There are some fits that I could see, because both of those guys have a little bit of control left. Could a team that's sort of in the middle of tanking and contending, like the Cubs or the Red Sox, be interested in a Dom Smith? Maybe, sure. And I think there's been some tire kicking there. But at the end of the day, these just aren't guys that obviously are anywhere near the peak of their value. So the Mets have to deal with that reality.
So the one that the fan base has been all over for a while because of the lack of production from catcher. When James McCann was healthy, now he's not. Obviously, Tomas Nido, we know his shortcomings at the plate, is Willson Contreras. Now, that's a big trade piece at this deadline, and it could cost the top prospect. So Andy, what is your take on the catching situation? The Mets have made it very clear they are not going to rush Francisco Alvarez to Queens. Do you think this is a situation that they do look at the top of the market, or are they content with riding this out?
I think they like Contreras. I know they like Contreras. I know they've asked about him, but I think you're right, Connor. He probably costs more prospect-wise than what the Mets want to spend this year is where that ultimately probably goes.
At the DH spot, do you think the Mets are looking for more of a platoon mate for Vogelbach that hits lefties, or more of a full-time DH that kind of pushes Vogelbach into, a bench power bat?
They could go either way. There's no rule that says they can't trade Vogelbach this week, too. There was a lot of interest in him from when he was in Pittsburgh. Billy Epler could turn around and capitalize on that interest with another contending club if he acquires what he believes is a full-time DH. So that's on the table. That's not something that's super active right now. I'm just saying, like, you could do that. Or if you get a platoon guy, you could, if you're the Mets, you could just basically upgrade the Smith-Davis platoon with a righty-lefty, and Vogelbach could be part of that. So we'll see how this plays out. I think if they get Trey Mancini, which is someone who they like, Vogelbach fits. The two of them could platoon a little at DH. Mancini's got the positional flexibility that in the corners, at least, that Epler likes. So it sort of depends who they get. I'm not necessarily seeing the impact bat out there other than a Willson Contreras who could be like the full-time DH. So probably more of a platoon. But you know what? We'll see what happens with J.D. Martinez, too, because that would be one of those impact players who could be the full-time DH, obviously.
We know the reliever market's going to be pretty active, Andy, and the Mets already sent one out when they're a team that needs to be bringing them in. I think Joely Rodriguez has had his struggles as their lefty out of the pen. We know what happened with Chase and Shreve. Knowing that they clearly need a lefty, do you think this is a situation, Andy, that they might be acquiring more than one reliever, especially after trading Holderman?
Well, they should. They need to. Obviously, they do not have the bullpen for a deep October run. I think that's pretty clear. Now, having said that, you're going to move a starter to maybe the bullpen once you're in October, a lot like Bartola, Colon, and what were the other starters? Syndergaard, obviously, coming out of the bullpen in 15. So that you can make it work in October, but obviously Adam Ottavino has been a nice piece for them. You don't want him to be your number 2 high leverage reliever, your 8th inning guy, however you want to put it. When the Yankees got the best out of Ottavino, he was a little bit further down that pecking order for them. So, they could use, I think, they're 2 relievers away. And the Holderman piece, in trading Holderman, that's one of those situations where you just hope/assume that the Mets know something about Holderman that we don't. On the surface, it's a big give, but you never know what teams have in their proprietary info, like, sell high on this guy because XYZ is arm angle, his spin, his health, or I don't have this. I'm not saying that, but like, you hope they have something on Holderman like that when it was time to trade him, because that's someone who, given what they need in their bullpen, they're going to miss.
Yeah, Holderman certainly has had his history of some injury things, so that maybe wouldn't be overly surprising. And obviously our focus is on the DH in the bullpen, but I think one thing that goes a little under the radar is with the chance that Jacob deGrom, Chris Bassitt, and Taijuan Walker hit free agency in the winter. Has there been any thought to acquiring a cost-controlled starting pitcher now to kind of get ahead of the market, or do you think that's just something that they'll just address in the winter?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense, but the problem is it runs up against their other goal, which is to not trade top prospects, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, Luis Castillo or Frankie Montas would fit that bill, and this is a problem the Mets will be facing in the offseason, losing most of the rotation to free agency. And they might bring some of those guys back, but they're free agents. Those guys can sign with anyone. They don't have a control over enough starting pitchers for next year. It's a great point. We'll see if Epler's got something up his sleeve in that regard, even maybe for more of a back end guy. Who is a name and then like a type who I could see answering that question, Joe, is like Merrill Kelly in Arizona. They've had interest in him in the past. It's a guy who could be your 3 or your 4 next year, just for some insurance. Because, yes, absolutely, they're looking down the barrel of deGrom, Walker, and Bassitt, all possibly playing for different teams next year.
All right, last one, Andy. Speaking of pending free agents, out of Nimmo, Diaz, and Bassitt, who have all had big moments for this club all year. Which one of them has made themselves the must-extend player from this first half of the season, and have any of those conversations started?
That's a great question. I would say I'd take Bassitt off the list because if you look at free agents, starting pitchers next year, they used to be A's. I kind of like Sean Manaea, maybe a little bit more long-term. I like Bassitt, but so not, I think he's good, but probably you can find someone. Nimmo and Diaz, it's tough to give up either one of those guys. But at the end of the day, it's so hard to find a top closer. And Diaz is if you're the Mets, you've suffered through Diaz coming into his own, and now he's come into his own. That he seems to want to be here. That's a guy to me that it would be tough to lose. Nimmo would be tough to lose as well, but yeah, I'd go Diaz there. I don't think those conversations have happened in earnest on any of those players yet.
Well, you gave the right answer, Andy. We'll just go with that.
Oh, well, thank you, Joe. I passed the test.
All right, I lied, Andy. I have one more question for you. I am not letting you appear on the Mets pod without asking you about Juan Soto. I feel like it's my obligation. I feel like the fans would understandably be very upset. So I know you've been all over this. I know you've kind of hinted at that. Listen, the Nationals probably don't want to trade their 23-year-old megastar within the division. So what do you think the latest is with Soto and specifically with the Mets?
Not much doing there that I sensed, Connor, with the Mets. They were intrigued like any team should be when they first got word of this availability. They looked into it, and it just didn't pick up a lot of traction over that All-Star break week. Picked up a little more traction with the Yankees. But you hear a lot about like out-of-market teams, even for the Nationals, like San Diego, St. Louis, Seattle. I think part of that might just be the human nature for Mike Rizzo and the Nationals of if you feel like you have to move this guy, get him out of your time zone, get him on a site. It won't feel as bad. And I think there's some of that going on for sure. And then there's a legitimate kind of old school Mets Nationals rivalry going on, I think, where they don't want to help them. Probably run up the same thing against Josh Bell a little bit too. So I wouldn't say the Mets are completely out on Soto, but pretty close.
Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, there's a division tax at the absolute least. So Andy Martino, SNY's MLB Insider. I know it's a crazy time of year, so thank you so much for some time today.
Okay, guys. Take care. My pleasure.
All right, reminder, you're listening to the Mets Pod. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Joe, great stuff with Andy Martino, but you and I have a trade to discuss because the Mets have made a move, and it's already had a small impact on the team. That is the absolute unit I had been calling for in Daniel Vogelbach. A pretty good return for the Pirates getting Collin Holderman, which we can address that part after. But with Vogelbach, Joe, this gives the Mets finally a DH that can at least hit righties. I don't think he's going to play against lefties. The splits are drastic. This is a player that has around a 900 OPS against righties this year, all 12 of his home runs against righties. But I think for the Mets, Joe, that's a significant upgrade.
Oh, it's a significant upgrade. I mean, Dom Smith hasn't hit a home run in literally over a calendar year. His last home run was July 21st, 2021. So it's been literally over a year since he hit a home run. So Vogelbach obviously brings to the table that thump that you're looking for. And, man, it's great to see him on the base paths, just chugging along and finding his way second to home. That was definitely fun to watch. But when you think about how they're going to be handling the DH, like Andy mentioned, you know, maybe it is a platoon situation where they're going to go get a right-handed bat and kind of just split up the duties between Vogelbach and him. But they needed power. You know, we've talked about this offense over the last few months, that it's a contact-oriented lineup. It's a work counts lineup. But it got to the point where the power was just too low, and they had to make a move. And obviously, like you said, it costs something with some control and certainly some intrigue. But you got to give the get, and Vogelbach actually has 3 years of control after this if the Mets want. So definitely the Pirates didn't have pressure to trade him, so you had to give something up.
Yeah, so this kind of carves out the pathway for the Mets over the next week, right? When you look at it, Joe, the route they can go is Vogelbach can be a classic Joe word, platoon player, where he's going to bat against righties. And once again, a significant upgrade in that department. Dom Smith right now in the year, 560 OPS, has not hit a home run. We know what Vogelbach can do against righties. You can go out and acquire a player that hits lefties. You can maybe call up Mark Vientos. Maybe that's a conversation for another day. You can go acquire a player that plays every day at the DH, and Vogelbach is your best bench bat, which has been a little bit of an issue for the Mets at times this year. So that's a big-time need, especially when you're playing postseason baseball as well. So I think when you look at it, it's going to be a really interesting week, and I'm sure the Mets don't even know what they're doing yet because it's going to matter on the cost. But speaking of the cost, I want to briefly touch on Collin Holderman. Joe, were you surprised by the return of this? It felt like a lot of Mets fans were surprised to see them send a valuable piece from the bullpen.
Billy Epler said it was kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul a little bit. But, like I said, the Pirates had no pressure to trade him, so they had the ability to say, this is what we want, and if you don't give it, we're just going to keep him. And obviously Holderman's a guy that has 6 years of control. He looked good in 17 innings with the Mets this year, and it ups the pressure to require a couple relievers here over the next week. But I think it's kind of you give to get, and, I think ultimately Holderman's ceiling is probably more of just, a good middle reliever, which it's somewhat replaceable asset. I'm not trying to put him down at all because he's been great, but, it feels like the kind of guy, like, you could find another Colin Holderman relatively easily. It'd probably be pretty hard to replicate everything that comes with Daniel Vogelbach.
I think there was a little bit of a fear as well, obviously, that the Mets could watch the entire hitters market fly off the board when it comes to deadline day, and there might be prices that they're afraid of reaching where now you at least have something in place. A week in advance, you have something in place that, once again, you can fall back to one of those pathways that I mentioned, whether it is calling up Vientos, whether it is acquiring a guy that splits, obviously platoons with Vogelbach, or maybe you do still go get that big fish that's going to play every day. But Holderman, there's a nice story this year, a former 9th-round pick, but the Mets believe that they're going to be able to replace him and a lot of different options in that bullpen. So not the end of the world. It's going to be a really interesting 7 days ahead of us. Speaking of Vogelbach, let's talk about the offense right now. The bottom line is the numbers since June have not been very good. And on the flip side, the Mets pitching has been tremendous. The starting pitching is keeping them in every single game, Joe. So when you look at those numbers, I want your thoughts on this, but my thought is it's kind of a good thing in a sense that the Mets, I think, have the hardest part figured out. They have starting pitching that keeps them in every single game. Now you need to go address the offense at the deadline, which they've already begun to do, but they need to continue further to enhance that. How do you take these numbers? Are you concerned about the Mets? Do you think this is who they are, or do you think this is clearly just a combined team slump?
I think it's more of the latter than the former. I mean, for the first 2.5 months of the season almost, we were talking about how much we love this offense and the way they played, and obviously it's been rough, and I think part of it is probably the lack of home run power. Like, yes, they're contact oriented, but if you're just putting the ball in play, there is obviously the chance that you're hitting it at people, and the Mets have obviously done a ton of that. So the lack of power in the lineup, I think, is really starting to shine through. And you kind of need to find that balance. You don't want to be too feast or famine, where it's home run or you're definitely not hitting. But I also think, guys like Starling Marte, that he's been really good, but I think even he could be a little more consistent. Jeff McNeil feels like he's going through it a little bit over the last couple weeks, so you got to get him back going. They'll add someone else, I assume, in addition to Vogelbach. But the offense, it's largely going to be just getting these guys to be a little more consistent because they clearly have the talent level. Like, you don't look up and down this lineup and like, it's just they're just not hitting very well right now. So it's kind of a bit of a, just work through this here slump that they've had for going on a month almost now.
And I think quietly, even Nimmo has not been himself. He's been good this year. He's been drastically improved in center field. He's been fine as a leadoff man, but even when you dive into Nimmo's numbers, Joe, this is a guy in recent history that gets on base at around a 400 clip, and right now he's sitting at 350. That's a drastic difference from your leadoff man, and I don't think it's raised a flag for concern for Nimmo. Don't extend him, anything like that. I just think that we know Nimmo can play at a much higher level, and he'll get there. but that still goes back to your point that they're getting on base. These guys are getting on base. They need people that will drive runs in. So let's dive into what's available out there. We obviously touched on some of it with Andy, but I think we didn't get into specific names outside of Trey Mancini. When you look at this market, we know there might be a division tax paid if they want to go the route for Josh Bell. We know Mancini's name has been out there despite the Orioles playing really, really well. You have a guy like Cron, who's you mentioned very early in the season from the Rockies, although the home and away splits from Coors Field are drastically different. Is there one guy, Joe, that makes a ton of sense for their DH spot at the market outside of already acquiring Vogelbach? Or do you think this really depends on the prospect cost going back in return?
I think it definitely depends on the prospect cost, but if it kind of depends what you're looking for. Like if you just want to own 2 pure DHs on the roster, then if Boston's selling J.D. Martinez, like that's the guy. He is definitely going to be the most impactful bat.
Kills lefties.
Yeah, kills lefties and he hits righties too. So like he's just a fantastic hitter. But he's really a DH. The Red Sox don't even put him in the outfield anymore. So if you're looking for, hey, they just need power, they just need a bat, J.D. Martinez is that guy. I think the balance of having some level of defensive versatility in addition to being able to hit is Trey Mancini. I think he's probably, to me, probably the best fit amongst the kind of DH type of guys. He could hit lefties and righties pretty similarly. His power numbers are a little down this year, but I think a lot of that is due to the wall change out in Baltimore where they like moved the wall back like 100 feet and no one could hit home runs there except Aaron Judge. And there's actually like using StatCast, if Trey Mancini played all of his games at Citi Field, he would have 16 home runs so far this year instead
compared
of the
to
8
9
that he has. Yeah, 9.
Wow.
Yeah, so definitely I think he's affected by the ballpark. And he's just, a great clubhouse guy. Buck knows him really well. To me, it just feels like Trey Mancini to the Mets just makes too much sense for it not to happen. But definitely my eyes are on Mancini, J.D. Martinez, and then, of course, keep your eye on Willson Contreras because you can't deny the possibility that the Mets want to upgrade the catching position.
Yeah, I think Contreras is so fascinating because the Mets are probably going to draw a hard line, as we mentioned. I think you and I both agree, and this is something that Andy touched on. We don't expect Francisco Alvarez and Brett Baty to be going anywhere at this trade deadline. We expect both of those players most likely to be playing in Queens at some point in the next 2 years, and we know Alvarez will be sooner than Baty. Do you think that takes the Mets out of Contreras? Because you're going to have teams, whether it's the Padres or somebody along that line, that might be willing to pay up a different level of prospect package that the Mets, who went down that road with the Cubs last year, might have a little bit of skepticism or fear of doing it again, despite how bad things are for them at catcher right now.
It's very possible that the price ends up too big. I mean, there's obviously some teams with a little deeper farm system than the Mets have. But I think, if Willson Contreras is a guy that ends up going for like a top 50, top 70 prospect in baseball, something like that, then, kind of kudos to that team. You gave up a lot, but you got a good rental piece. And something that I actually thought about, another rental catcher that's kind of under the radar. I wonder if you talk to the Boston Red Sox, can you convince them to package Christian Vasquez with J.D. Martinez? And he's, an average receiver, slightly above average pop time to second base. He's had a pretty solid offensive year, but solid is a drastic difference from the worst offensive production at the catching position. So it'll be interesting to see if Epler could be creative instead of just purely, going off the names that you and I have talked about and the media is talking about.
It's a great call. I haven't heard Vasquez's name mentioned at all, and a lot of that has probably been due to the Red Sox had a really rough week. They played a couple football games score-wise, and I think when you look at it, you're always looking for players that are going to hit the market. He's finishing up a 4-year, $20.3 million deal. He will hit free agency in the winter, so that if the Red Sox are going to go into sell mode, knowing that regime, they're probably going to go all in to sell mode, not 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And he's a guy that could be on the move. I mean, you're right, Joe. Offensively, he's had a nice year. 8 home runs in a little under 300 plate appearances, 753 OPS. You mentioned the defensive metrics as well. So I think sometimes, Joe, and we're guilty of it, all Mets fans are guilty of it, we get so laser locked on the same names we've heard for 3 months. Contreras, of course. Mancini, who has a lot of ties to the Mets, we know that. Josh Bell, that you forget the secondary market, to bring back the Braves again from last year, those secondary and third-tier market players on the deadline, when you get them in volume, is sometimes the way that you can win a World Series.
Oh, definitely. And, maybe if we had sources like Andy does, we'd know about these guys a little ahead of time and start talking about them. But I think the market is definitely going to be something that develops here over the next 4 or 5 days, because the Red Sox are still kind of teetering, and they have to decide, are we actually contenders? Because Chaim Bloom's the kind of guy that even if they're like mathematically still like reasonably close, I think he has the wit to be like, all right, maybe we could sneak into that extra wild card spot, but this isn't a team that's going to make a run. So let's do the right thing. Let's kind of not rebuild, but just retool for 2023, because the Red Sox have talent. But maybe it's a situation where they sell some rentals for some close to major league type pieces and, just go back at it in 2023.
Yeah, in the American League right now, you have the Red Sox, the Orioles, and the White Sox are those three teams that are hanging around, and they're going to have hard decisions to make. And we've talked about players from all three of those teams that could be, sold at the market. The Giants are a team playing .500 baseball. We know the pieces they have as well. The Rockies seem like they're out of it, and that Cron could be on the move. So, and we already saw the Pirates make a move. So with the expanded playoffs, it's going to be a fascinating market. But we'll have everything deadline covered on next week's show. We didn't talk a ton about the relief market today. We know the Mets bullpen is going to look much different next time we record a show. So we will definitely dive all into that on next week's. To close out this week's, as we always do, the mailbag questions. And they are around a topic that we have not discussed enough in terms of baseball terms. We talk about it on trade terms all the time. This one from Drew Kellenberger. He said, with the Mets looking to add another bat, do you think they trade Dom Smith and J.D. Davis for some bullpen help? We talked about that with Andy, but he said maybe throw in a mid-level prospect or two to sweeten the deal. Joe, the part of that question I wanted to focus on is, we talk about Baty, Alvarez, Mauricio, Vientos. Who do the Mets have that is even considered a mid-tier prospect that could be thrown into these types of packages if they want to avoid the A-listers?
Maybe a Calvin Ziegler or a Dom Hamill. Maybe those are two guys that would interest some teams, second and third rounders from the 2021 class, who Ziegler's right now has some bicep tendonitis, but he's going to be okay, just a short-term deal. Dom Hamill's been very good since he got promoted to Brooklyn. And for me, depending on the deal, I updated my top 10 prospect list at SNY.TV after the draft, and I'm going to be the low man on Ronnie Mauricio. To me, I just don't think the pitch recognition skills have grown really much at all in almost 3 years now. So I have quite a bit of question as to what his offensive profile is going to be going forward. I don't know if that's kind of a consensus out there in the world of baseball. I still think there are teams that are high on Ronnie, but in the right deal, I think that's kind of where my cutoff is. So I dropped Ronnie to number 6. So my top 5, I'd really like to hang on to if we're talking rental pieces. But Ronnie Mauricio, I think, is a guy that in the right scenario, maybe it's a bullpen guy and an offensive bat. Maybe that's someone that I would at least consider discussing.
All right, this one from Ira. We'll go a little rapid fire with the last few here. He said, I get that Vientos strikes out more to their liking, but he is mashing against lefties. There's a week before the deadline. Why are they being stubborn and not bringing him up and to see how he can do at this point?
At this point, I hate to say it this way, but I can't think of a better description. I don't see the point in doing it now. I mean,
not enough time.
Yeah, the deadline is 1 week and a couple hours away. Like, what are you going to see from Mark Vientos in 4 games before the deadline that is going to even mean anything to you? Like, are you calling him up and saying, if he's really good for this week, we're not going to trade for somebody?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah, he should have been called up a couple weeks ago. I've tweeted about this. I don't quite understand why he wasn't called up a couple weeks ago, but he wasn't. So at this point, I'd say let it be. Trade for a veteran, and maybe you call him up as a September call-up when rosters expand by a couple spots, just to add some thump to the bench for September.
That's what I was going to ask. I wonder if we see Vientos when the rosters expand and he gets some at-bats against lefties in key spots. It'd be fun to watch. All right, last one from the mailbag today. Jason Jones asked, Do you consider Brett Baty the third baseman of the future and Vientos more of a left fielder / DH? Joe, I know you said Vientos, the experiment in the corner outfield, was short-lived. So it seems like we can call Vientos a bat. But I think it's pretty clear, not just because of Escobar's struggles, but because of Baty's success, especially over the last month. He is the third baseman of the future for the New York Mets.
No question. And he's made strides defensively at third base where I don't think he's winning any gold gloves, but he's not kicking balls out there. His arm is strong enough and accurate. Yeah, he's not Alec Boehm, that's for sure. But yeah, I think defensively he's fine, and the bat has been great. And to me, he's hitting for more power this year. He's elevating the ball. His ground ball rate has drastically dropped. His line drive and fly ball rate have jumped up. So I think it's definitely a good step forward for Baty, who's now pretty much considered amongst the top 20 prospects in baseball. I think he has, serious 20, 25 home run power, and he's going to hit for average. His pitch recognition skills are very advanced for his age, and I think it's a possibility you see him in AAA Syracuse before the year's up.
All right, Joe. Trade deadline 1 week away. Obviously, we'll be back with a monster episode next week. I'm going to put you on the spot for your closing thoughts. Final predictions for the Mets at the deadline. They already got Vogelbach. What else do you think they do? I'll say I think it's going to be Mancini and 2 relievers. And I don't know if that'll excite Mets fans, but that's my final stance right now.
For the sake of being different, because I was going to say that, I'll say they get J.D. Martinez and 2 relievers. So I think there's a bat and 2 relievers coming in.
That would excite the fans, especially if Vasquez is in the deal with Martinez. That would be a mammoth trade deadline. A reminder to subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch on SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back next week to recap all of the moves the Mets make and where they are in the standings after a big series of 2 games against the Yankees as well. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.